Okay, this is homework help for Math 3 Unit 2 Worksheet 6, and I'm going to start with question number 2. So for question number 2, I need to make sure that I know what functions are what. So I know that f of x is the parabola, so I'm going to highlight that here. So that is that graph. And then I know that g of x is the other graph, so that is my line. So I'm just going to dot that so I have two different graphs I can be referring to. So when I look to do these questions, I have to know my definitions, right? I need to know my definitions. So when this says to list all of the labeled points that are solutions for f of x equaling 0. So I already know we're talking about f of x, so my only possible answer are any marked points here. So that would be at A, E, D, or C, right? Those are my only choices. And so this is telling me that f of x is equal to 0. So for f of x to equal 0, that's saying the same thing as y equaling 0. So if y is 0, that means I'm not going up or down. I'm staying right here, which is on the x-axis. So when I write this, then what we're looking for are x-intercepts. So where does f of x cross the x-axis? And that would be at point A and point D. So then my solutions would be A and D because those are the x-intercepts for the parabola. So for part B, it's asking us to list the labeled points for where g of x is equal to f of x. So those are intersections or where the graphs cross each other. So g will equal f, right, wherever they intersect or cross. So I want to look to see where does the line intersect the parabola, and they intersect at 2 points and both are labeled. So that would be at A and at C. For part C, it's asking us to list all of the labeled points that are solution for x equaling 0. So if x is equal to 0, we're not going left and we're not going right. So we're staying right here in the middle, right? If x is 0, we don't go left, we don't go right, we're in the middle. So then that means we are looking for y-intercepts. Okay, so again, we need to know these definitions, right? So you can look at your notes if you've forgotten what are different ways we can ask for x and y-intercepts. So I want the y-intercept for f of x. So I'm looking at my parabola. So where does the parabola cross the y-axis? And that would be down here at the vertex, which is at point E. Okay, so for part D, they're asking us to list all of the labeled points that are solutions for y equals f of x. So a common mistake students make is they think they're looking for the y-intercept. But what they're saying is, where does y equal f of x? So when I'm given a value for x, and I produce a value for y, so what are just all the ordered pairs that are marked and labeled? So they want us to find all of the points on y equals f of x. So what are all of the points on y equals f of x? So I have to look at finding everything along this graph that has a marked and labeled point. So there's one at E. Oops, I just realized I skipped A. How about at A and E? So those are all marked and labeled. And then again at D, and finally at C. So again, this is confusing because a lot of students think it means only where it touches the y, but it's every point on the function. And so for part E, same thing, but this time we're looking for on y equals g of x, so y equals g of x. So this time we just want what are all the points on the line. So when I look at the line here, I've got a point A, B, and C. So the 3 points listed are A, B, and C. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at question number 3. So here we have two graphs again. So we have our function f of x, which is our linear, and then we have g of x, which is our curve. So g of x is our curve, f of x is our linear. So for part A, so what's different here is we're not listing points, we're just having either a specific value or number answers. So how many solutions are there for f of x equaling 0? So we want to just know how many for f of x equaling 0. So that's the same as y equaling 0. So if y is equal to 0, that means I'm not going up or down, so that would be my x-axis. And so where is my line here crossing? And it never crosses, it's running parallel. So there would be no solution or no times that they touch or cross. Okay, for part B, how many solutions are there for g of x equaling f of x? So again, this is the same thing as where do they intersect. So we want to know where g intersects f. So we're looking for intersections. So they intersect here, so 1, 2, 3. So they have 3 points of intersection, so that would just be 3. For part E, we want to know f of 2.5, so they're giving us a value for x, and then they're asking for a value for y. So when x is 2.5, what is f of 2.5? So that's the y value. So I'm looking on my graph of f here. So when I go to 2.5, and I look here, that would be at 2, right? So 1, 2. And then let's take a look at E here. So on what interval is g of x, so approximately, less than -3? So first of all, let's make sure we understand this part. So this is a y value, so I'm going to go to where y is -3, so 1, 2, 3. So here's y is -3. And I want to know when g of x, so that's my curve, when would it be below -3, right? When would it be below -3? So that's those two sections here, right? So this section here is below -3, and this section is below -3. And so I have to do intervals. So we'll start with this one right here. So how far left is it going? It's going to -infinity. And then how far right? So we're going to have to approximate that, so that's not exact, but it looks like it's around 1.5 or -1.5. So I'm going to do an open interval there. So it's somewhere around -1.5, not very precise, so 1.5. And then this section here is also below -3, so I'm just going to count over to it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 6, 7, 8, 9. So it looks like it's somewhere between 6 and 9. Okay. All right, and D and F, you can ask in class if you're not sure about it. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at question number 4 here. So for this one, I'm going to do this on a separate graph because the graphs are really small. Okay. All right, so for question number 4, we want to graph our functions. So let me do a table here. Or not a table, sorry, coordinate axes. Okay, so when x is 0, my y value is -5. So this is just saying when x is 0, my y value for f is -5. So I'm going to go over 0, down 5. And when x is 1, my y value is -2, right? So when x is 1, my y is -2. And here, when x is 2, my y value is +1. And when x is 3, my y value is negative 5. Okay. And then once I get to here, I want to go ahead and connect those. And then label this as f of x. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to do the same thing for g of x. So it's still the same x values, but now my y values are different. So I have to look up here for x and then down here for y. So when x is 0, my y value is negative 7. And here, when x is 1, my y value is negative 3. And when x is 2, my y value is 2. And finally, when x is 3, my y value is negative 1. And label that g of x. Okay, so that's going to be my graph that I'm going to be using. Okay. So for here, it says they want us to shade the intervals between the integers where the solutions to f of x equals g of x must exist, right? Must exist. So we're looking for where do those two graphs intersect. So we're looking for where do they intersect. And so if I look here, so it looks like the point of intersection, so where my f graph and g graph are crossing right around here. And so that's somewhere just a little bit past 1, so that means between 1 and 2 they intersect, right? So somewhere between 1 and 2 they intersect. So between 1 and 2. Okay. All right, for part B, they want us to determine where f of x is equal to 0. So f of x equals 0. So that means your y value equals 0. So if y is equal to 0, that means you're not going up or down any. So then that means if you're not going up or down, you're crossing the x-axis. So we're looking for our x-intercepts. So for our f of x graph. So if I look at my graph over here, so f of x is my pencil. So where is it crossing the x-axis? So there's one point where it crosses, and that's between 1 and 2, right? So between 1 and 2 is one time it crosses, and then a little bit past 2, so somewhere between 2 and 3. So between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. So I'm going to shade the interval between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. And then for part C, they're looking for where g of x is equal to 4. So g of x is the same as my y value. So I want to know where y equals 4. So I'm going to look at my graph here. So I'm going to go up to 4. So y equals 4 is somewhere up here. And I want to know where g of x crosses 4. And it doesn't, right? It doesn't get up that high. So then this would have a no solution, right? So there's no interval. And that's because g of x has a highest value of 2. And that's it for worksheet 6.